Hello, welcome to Quilter's Architect. My name is Mark, and in today's video, I want to introduce a pattern to you in which you can use yardage, you can use from your fat quarters, or you can use from your scraps. Here are my thoughts on using scraps for this project. You could use 416 of your 2.5-inch squares and 140 of your 5-inch squares, or if you happen to have scrap strips, you could use 38 width of fabric by 5-inch strips and 36 width of fabric by 2.5-inch strips. If you use your fat quarters for this project, you could use 8 to cut 100 of the 4.5 and 4 7/8 inch squares, and 4 to cut 80 of the 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles, and 8 fat quarters to cut 416 of the 2.5-inch squares, and then 10 fat quarters to cut 20 of the 9.25-inch squares, and considering the other pieces, a total of around 40 fat quarters. Now this quilt pattern is called All My Exes, and here's a quick look at it. I am going to also present in this quilt pattern the option to do either a full-size quilt or a table topper or wall hanging. And so I'm going to demonstrate the table topper or wall hanging, and I'm going to do that in two ways because the quilt pattern has cool colors. And so I have here some fat quarters, and these correspond to the cool color representation of what the pattern could look like. And you'll see here in the pattern I have something called dark plum, and this is the fat quarter that I plan to use for that. I have in the pattern something called lilac, and here's the fabric I plan to use for that. From that fat quarter, I also have something called light lilac, and this is the fabric I plan to use for that. I also have fabric labeled as teal in the pattern, so I plan to use this fat quarter. And then lastly, I have some white. It looks like sashing in the quilt, but in the table topper or wall hanging ends up looking like a border. And so here's the fat quarter that I'm going to use for that white fabric. Now I'm also going to demonstrate using scraps. I've also wanted to do a warm version of this table topper since the quilt pattern shows it kind of like with a cool set of colors. Going into some of our scraps, we had this set of fabrics that would work well for like a warm variation on the quilt. What in the cool version I'm calling dark plum, I plan to use this fabric. In the center of the blocks, I'm using that dark plum as a large square in the center of the block, and I'm going to use this because I had that available in our scraps. Also, we have the fabric labeled teal in the cool colors for the pattern itself. And so I found this, and I have 2 fabric pieces for teal for the wall hanging. And so I'm going to use this for that teal. I have some rectangles and I have some squares in that teal color. So we have that lilac fabric in our cool set of colors. And we found this in our stash that we could use for the lilac. So we also have with our flying geese the light lilac fabric, and in our warm version we found this in our scraps. This will work out nice for the large square that's required to make 4 flying geese. And then also in our scraps we had this fabric, and we'll use this for the fabric labeled as white in our pattern. And so we can see how if we went down the route of using scraps, this has 20 blocks in the quilt. So we could pull from our scraps and make 20 variations on those blocks and try to coordinate them the best we could from our scraps that we have available. And then of course, a person could also choose to go the yardage route, either purchasing yardage or using yardage that they already have on hand. And you can see that again, for the quilt top itself, it's a little under 10 yards total of fabric. And for the table topper or wall hanging, it's about 1.5 yards of fabric in total. I've broken the steps and information about the 2 different options out into 2 categories: option 1, quilt top; option 2, table topper or wall hanging. And so if you look on page 2 at the top for fabric requirements for option 1, for the dark plum, we need 1 7/8 inch yards. For teal, we need 1.5 yards. And for lilac, the medium color, we need 2 5/8 yards. For the light lilac, we need 1 3/8 yards. And then for white, we need 2 yards. yards. If we're looking at the fabric requirements and we want to go down the wall hanging or table topper route, you can see that it's much less, right? Because we're really just making one block. And so you can see that here we need 3/8 of a yard of the dark plum, a 1/4 yard of teal, a 1/4 yard of lilac, a 3/8 of a yard of light lilac, and a 1/4 yard of white. So looking at the design of this quilt pattern, you can see that I'm using what looks like a sawtooth star, and it kind of also has that Irish chain effect with the 4 patches, the way they're arranged in the quilt inside the sashing and going across diagonally both directions. And then also you'll notice that we have for the quilt top itself a border that's a 4-inch border that has those cornerstone 4 patches. Now for the table topper or wall hanging, this is 24 by 24, and this gives us a much more rapid project if we don't have a lot of time or we have less fabric we want to use for this project. And you can see that the sashing or the white fabric in the pattern is kind of like a border for the wall hanging or the table topper. The block itself is identical to the block in the quilt. So as I demonstrate making the 2 table topper versions of this, one with cool colors, one with warm colors, you'll get to see all the steps involved in making these blocks. And then the rest of the quilt, as far as like assembly, all of that's going to be in the pattern that you can refer to. So it's time to get started and jump right in. I think what I'll do is I'm going to start with the fat quarter, the cool version of colors or fabrics, because that's the way the pattern is displaying or representing it visually. And then once that's done, I'll also show you the scrap version with the warm colors. So I do have a few brief notes here about the pattern. I'm assuming a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can press the seams as desired. And typically for width of fabric, we're looking for something like 43, 42.5 inches of usable fabric. I hope you decide to join along with me and make this quilt or this table topper or wall hanging. And it's a fairly simple design. The block itself is not very difficult. We have a few flying geese, we have some 4 patches, but really it's a fairly straightforward block design. There's nothing too complex about it. So let's get started. I'm going to make the table topper or wall hanging, and you'll see all the steps involved in the pattern. So it's going to be an interesting project. So on page 3, we see the first thing we really need to do is do our cutting. I'll do that off camera so as not to bore you with cutting fabric. And once I have all the fabric pieces cut and ready, I'll show you that here in just a little bit. So here you can see for the warm set of fabrics, I have all the pieces cut. And this is not very difficult to get all this ready for the table topper at all. And here's a quick look at the cool set of fabrics for the other table topper. You can see here on the table, I have the fabric pieces for the 4 patches laid out. This is the cool fabric version of the table topper. And on page 4 of our quilt pattern, we have our instructions. And you'll notice here that if we're doing the table topper, we're making 8. If we're doing a quilt top, we're making 84. Of course, you may choose to do strip sets. I'm only making the table topper, so I chose not to do strip sets. But a person making the quilt top, if they like strip sets and how that goes, they might choose to cut their fabric into strips only and make strip sets instead of doing individual pieces for their 4 patches. So time to join these together. And again, I only have to make 8 for this cooler fabric version of the table topper, and I'll do that now. Imagine most of you are already experts at making 4 patches, but in case not, for anyone who needs it, here's some detailed instructions. Okay, I finished up the 4 patches. Time to move on to the next step. You can refer to the appendix about flying geese if you're not already familiar with making them. And so the instructions that I have in this pattern are to make 4 flying geese out of this large 9 1/4 inch square and these 4 4 7/8 inch squares. So I'm going to follow those instructions. You can refer to those as well. And basically what we're doing is we're joining these smaller squares to the large square in a successive manner so that we end up with flying geese. And we'll do this multiple passes, right? And then once we get 2 flying geese, then we'll end up with another set. We'll get 2 more flying geese. So I'm going to work on that next. We need a total of 4 flying geese for the wall hanging or table topper. As the appendix shows, for making flying geese out of these 2 different squares, we're going to mark our line down the back or the wrong side of the smaller square, lay them on the larger square, and then what we'll do is we'll sew a line down each side of that line, right? And that way we can cut the fabric on the line. And if you feel it's helpful, you may choose to pin these. So you can see I've sewn a line down this side of the line. Now I'm going to go down the other side. So now we have our 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side of the line. We'll cut directly on this line to end up with 2 units that then will continue so that we can make our 4 flying geese. But we need to press our seams. So I'm going to press them like this. And again, that first pass or 2 is just to kind of get the edge of that starting to fold with the heat. And then the other thing is I'm staying away from the corner out here, since it's cut on the bias, to avoid distorting the fabric as much as I can, right? So I'll do the same for the other one. So now that we have our first units pressed, then what we want to do is take our other square on each unit. We'll have a line marked diagonally corner to corner and position it on here, and then we'll join this, a seam on each side, a 1/4 inch on each side of this line, and that way we'll end up with 2 units from each of these units, which will give us our 4. Same thing as before. Once we have our seam down one side of the line, we'll just do the same on the other side of the line. And now that we have that done, we'll be able to cut each one like this on the line that we drew. So now we'll put our ruler corner to corner on the line we drew and cut once again. And of course, we end up with these little dog ears because of the way the angle of the fabrics comes together and the overlap. So all we'll do is trim these off. The light's already starting to go down outside. It's also cloudy today. Okay, so there's one of our flying geese. I'll trim up the dog ears on the remaining ones, and we'll have our flying geese completed. You can refer to page 5 in the pattern for instructions on assembling the block. On page 5, our instructions continue to explain with the illustration how we would assemble this block. And we have this center unit that we're going to make. So I plan to join these 3 pieces as a unit, these 3 as a unit, and then these 3 as a unit, and then join those 3 units to form the center unit. So I'll do that and show you that once it's done. I formed those 3 units here of the center unit, and now I'll join these 3 together to complete the center unit. I've completed the center unit, and now I just need to, according to the instructions, I'll join the top 3 pieces as a unit, the 2 flying geese and the center unit, and then the bottom 2 4 patches in the bottom flying geese. So once I have those 3 units, I'll be able to join all 3 of those to create the block. Okay, so I have the 3 units joined together as illustrated in the instructions on the pattern. Now I'll just join this together to complete this block. And here on page 6 in the pattern, it shows how we join these 3 units together to complete the block. I'm just going to press this block, and then I'll lay the ruler corner to corner so I can trim off the ravelings on all 4 sides. And here's a little better view of the block straight on. And now it's time to move on to the borders and the cornerstone blocks. Here on page 7 in our pattern, it illustrates how to join fabric pieces I, the 4-patch cornerstones, and the block to form the table topper. So here on the sewing table, I have all the pieces laid out with the block in the center, the border around the edges with the cornerstones. So it's time to join these together. And here you can see where I've joined those 3 units, and now join these 3 units together to form the entire table topper. And now I'm going to just put the ruler corner to corner and trim off the ravelings to even up the edges. So here is the inner quilt for the table topper. I really like how this turned out. I am going to check on my starch and my iron. Might need to get some water and spritz this and work a little bit on those wrinkles. Now let me show you the warm variation on this table topper with the different fabric selection. And I won't get into the detailed steps. I'll just show you incrementally the things completed. First, I need to make these 4 patches. And here are my 4 patches all completed. And next I'll make the flying geese. Here are my 4 flying geese. This one is kind of growing on me. I think I like the warm color variation even better. So I have all the 4 patches, flying geese, and other fabric pieces laid out here on the table to start assembling. And here I have the center unit all joined together. And here I have the top, middle, and bottom units of the block joined together. And here's the All My Exes block, all units joined together. I really like this variation on the fabrics. And here I have the cornerstones, borders, and block all laid out on the table, ready to join together in units. Here I have those 3 units joined together. Now it's just the last step to join all 3 of these to form the table topper inner quilt. And here's the table topper all joined together. I'd like to get your all's feedback. What do you like the best, the warm set of fabrics or the cool set of fabrics in the table topper? If you choose to make the quilt top instead of table topper, you'll need to follow some additional instructions. Here on page 8, you see the instructions for making rows 1 to 4. On page 9, we have instructions for how to assemble the 5th row, which is different because it's at the bottom. On page 10, we have instructions for how to assemble the top half of the quilt, or rows 1 and 2. And then on page 11, we have the instructions for how to assemble the bottom half of the quilt, or rows 3, 4, and 5. And then on page 12, we have instructions for how to join the top and bottom halves of the quilt to form the entire inner quilt. On page 13, we have the instructions for how to join the inner quilt along with the cornerstone squares and the borders. Here you can see Sherry has the 2 table toppers loaded on the long arm side by side, which only makes sense, right? Since they're identical in dimensions, she can just line them up side by side and do them at the same time. And here you can see the selected quilting pattern, loopy plain ivies. And I wanted to show you the long arm running as it's doing the quilting. This is always a little bit fascinating to watch. Also, I thought I'd show you just a straight-on still shot of the quilting on both the table toppers. The quilting turned out really nice. Here's the binding that I prepared for the quilt with the cool range of fabrics. And here I'm starting to join the binding to the back of the quilt. And here I'm starting to join the binding to the front of the quilt. And here's the cool color version of the table topper all completed. And here you can see the warm version of the quilt and the binding fabric that I chose. And I'm just starting to do that work here. And here's a look at the warm variation on the table topper. I'll also take a picture here outside so you can see these really good. Here's a look at the warm version or warm variation of fabrics and colors and the backing. And then I'll also do a little video here where I pan across the table topper so you can see the quilting outside. And lastly, here's a look at the cool rendition of the quilt, the cool fabrics. Here's the backing, and I'll also do a video where you can see the quilting up close out here in the good light. I hope you enjoyed watching me make these table toppers from this quilt pattern. I hope it inspires you to also make the quilt or the table toppers. Please leave any comments you'd like to share. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. If you enjoy videos like this one, I encourage you to subscribe to my channel as well. Until the next video, I'm wishing you happy sewing and beautiful finishes.